Welcome. We are in the Civic Language webinar series we're calling Signal Speak. And this topic is the question, should we say patriotism? Which we know is a question on many people's minds. Before we go too much further, I want to just share a little bit about PACE itself for anybody who's new. I'm Amy McIsaac. I'm the Managing Director of Learning and Experimentation. I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Reverend Siri Erickson, who you'll hear from in a little bit. And PACE is a philanthropic laboratory. We are a group of funders who are in some way maximizing impact on democracy and civic life in America. So our funders are funding in a lot of different ways on a lot of different things. We have about 75 members. The thing that they all have in common is that they believe in a stronger American democracy and are investing their grant-making dollars towards that end. We have been in existence for almost 20 years, and 5 of those years, the last 5 of those years, we have taken a real focus on researching civic language perceptions. That sounds niche, and if it does sound niche, it's because it is. In 2019, when we started this journey, our members are really saying to us, I am sensing a coded and loaded nature of civic terms. It's starting to become a problem. How might I understand that better? And so 5 years ago, we looked around and said, well, let's find you some research. And we realized there really wasn't a lot available. So we really stepped into that space and did a 1,000-person survey to start to understand those questions. The project grew 2 years later. We went to 5,000 Americans and retested some words, but really expanded our research. Because really the question coming at us then was, I feel like there's a disconnect between the words I say and what people hear. So what should I say instead? A real appetite for guidance around civic language. So the work from that chapter of this journey was really getting us closer to a place of offering some thoughts and navigation to civic language and the words we might say. And we thought we were done with our civic language journey then in 2022. We did kind of hung up our shoes, as they say, but more people really coming to us. I think the demand was even larger going and looking ahead at 2024. And the question came at us a slightly different way, where people really asking us, are there even words I can say anymore? Feeling like we are at such a place of disconnect as Americans. How do I understand what's even safe to say? And so we designed this survey, which we went into the field in November of 2023 to help us understand where we are on perceptions as Americans on some key terms that we use often in our line of work, and why Americans hold the perceptions they do, and what influence those words might be having in our civic behavior and attitudes. So with that, I just want to give you some context about where you are joining us on this chapter of the journey. I won't go too far into the slide, but just to say we are in this flurry of learning and activity phase, which is why we're so grateful we have you guys here with us to help us make sense of some of the patriotism data specifically. But we designed the survey starting back in September, collected the data in November, have been doing our work to kind of understand the data, and are really blowing that up to do more of that, such that we're in a place where we really have looked deep under the hood here and have a sense by around August, September, right around when we get into that hardcore election season, what sense we make of what Americans are telling us about their relationships to civic words. I also want to, before we go into the data, make sure you have a sense of the survey instrument itself. The survey instrument is actually available on our website. pacefunders.org/language is kind of the front door to everything you're going to see here today. We partnered with Citizen Data. Many of you probably are familiar with them. They're a fantastic firm that looks at citizen-related work through a statistical lens. It was a 49-question survey that was gathering the perceptions from 5,000 Americans on 21 terms. So it was a painstaking process to take our very, very long list of words we wanted to test and bring it down to 21. But what you see in that light purple box are the 21 terms that we surveyed this time around. If it's bolded, it's because it was a repeat word from 2021. So those are the words that we'll be able to show you 2021 snapshot and a 2023 snapshot. We also grouped them by thematic cluster. And we did that because each respondent only saw 7 words. That was a recommendation by Citizen Data on a survey fatigue consideration. But we decided to do it thematically. So the same person saw the word democracy, as republic, as freedom, as liberty. And then a different person saw civic engagement and patriotism and belonging. So just know that from a methodology perspective. Next to the purple box, you can see all the identities we captured in the survey as well. Again, bolded means we captured that also 2 years ago, so we can see differences by those demographic cuts. And we were in the field in November of 2023. I think what's really important to note that it was the exact time 2 years earlier that we were in the field. So we're really seeing a pretty even 2-year snapshot of where Americans' nationally representative sample are in 2023. The other thing I think is important to note as you look at our analysis is that we did filter for registered voters. That was another recommendation by Citizen Data. So just know as you look at our data, this does not encapsulate Americans who are not registered to vote, just those who are registered to vote, which we know can change some of the interpretation a little bit. And the margin of error for my research friends out there is plus or minus 1.4%. So when we're seeing things close to each other, we'll point out if it's within a margin of error and what sense to make of that. So before we get into the data itself, we want to do a quick warm-up poll with you all to get a sense of where you all are on the word patriotism. So there's 4 questions here. It is a fully anonymous poll, so we cannot track who's answering what. But if you could engage with that, we'll look at that together. And while you do, I will just give you a voiceover of the visual on your screen. These are the ways that we have inputs from our survey to understand how Americans feel on a particular word. So we'll be able to look at what are their impressions, positive, negative, neutral, or unfamiliar. How do they feel like this word brings people together or drive people apart? Who do they think the term is meant for? Does this term motivate them to a certain particular civic action, which we'll talk more about? Are they positive on the word and why? And are they negative on the word and why? So we're going to get more into all of this, but this is kind of the mental framework to have in mind as we go through the data together. So we've got about 76 participants who filled this out. If you are almost at submit, do it now, because we're about to share the results back with everyone. Okay, that last person actually did just submit. Great. So Siri, great. So these are the results. So this is just a quick snapshot of where we are as a group. 57% are positive, and I spelled positive wrong. Apologies. 57% are positive, which is great. I'm glad to see nobody here is unfamiliar with this word. That's great. We don't have to do any term defining at the top. 21% are negative, and 21% are middle of the road. Good to know. I'm seeing much more belief from this group that patriotism is driving people apart more than it's bringing people together. That's great to see. Just good to know as we go in. Also seeing that we are a largely liberal group. I think it's important bias for us to name as we look at the data. Some moderates and actually nobody who identified as conservative. So that I think is really important for us to know as we go through this data. And I love the age spread. We've got a pretty even mix of younger, middle, and older. And the reason we asked that was because you'll see as we go into the data, age was presenting some very interesting storylines for us when we looked at patriotism as a term. Great. Thank you for engaging in that. So before we go into things, we are really excited to be joined by 2 speakers. And these are folks, and we're kind of experimenting here, who are going to share their take as we go through the analysis. We've got Dr. Elaine Arnott, who is the CEO of National Liberty Museum, and Jasmine Rogers, who's Civic Life and Policy Associate at Kansas Health Foundation, one of our PACE members. And so I'd love to invite Dr. Elaine Arnott first to share from a very high level who you are, what kind of perspectives you're bringing into this conversation, and at a high level, what are your impressions of patriotism as we get into this?
Great. Hi, everybody. Nice to meet you. As she said, my name's Elaine Arnott, and I'm CEO here at the National Liberty Museum. So I'm very excited actually to talk about this because actually you can see liberty, one of the words that the piece is looking at, is in our title. So we pretty much experience this on a daily basis. And so this is my day job and my night job in terms of tackling things just like this. And what I want to preface is, as a Liberty Museum, our objective is really to remain as balanced as possible. If I'm going to present something from one side, I'm going to do it from the other. And so going into this conversation, I'm going to be looking at it from more the conservative lens. But if they would have come to me and said, will you do this from the more liberal lens, I would have said yes to that as well. And I think that's important for me to just highlight to the group before we launch, that this isn't necessarily representative of the museum, but it's our ability to be very nimble with these conversations. So giving some thought back to patriotism, and it was great to talk with Jasmine as we got on, because we got to reminisce about the fact that we're both from the Midwest. And so patriotism for me was at the core of my youth. I was born and raised outside of Detroit. I was really raised extremely religious. That was just embedded in. It's almost like I didn't know it existed, but it existed inherently. I was raised during the time where you said the Pledge of Allegiance during class. It was the first thing you did. I went to religious school for a time, so we even said a prayer at the end. And I think what ended up happening for me in terms of my trajectory with this word was that I didn't really explore it in depth until I was in graduate school, to be very frank. That's where I started playing with this. And I'm like, what does that mean? Can I say the word, I love my country? Is that something wrong? Because you've got a lot of different personalities, as most of us know, if we've gone through the educational process in there. And as a result of that, I kind of started to explore, okay, do I love this country? What does that mean? And for me, it really was, if I'm going to live here, I want to embrace what the American experiment is about, and remember that I'm lucky to live in a country like this. And that's where the journey started. And then, of course, I had kids, and you start to have those like moments as a parent of like, okay, what kind of values do I want to instill and help my kids work through and be able to make their own decisions about how they feel. And I'm going to be mindful of time. I think I'm at 4, but that's where I have gone through my journey with this word, because I think this word at this point, it can be extremely polarizing. And how do we break down those barriers and get it back to just being a word?
Thank you. Awesome. Really appreciate those thoughts. Jasmine, over to you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you starting us off, because I completely agree with how do we get it back to a point where it's not as polarizing, because I think for me, also being from the Midwest, we had the same experience of you do the pledge every morning when school starts. And I guess I should say a little bit about myself. I was born and raised in Kansas. I'll probably live here forever. I was raised by my mom and my older brother. She was a single mom. We grew up 2 doors down from my grandpa's house. So he was a huge, huge influence on my life. He also served in Vietnam, and that was something that he never wanted to talk about because of that experience for him as being a teenager. And so I think for me, my definition of patriotism wasn't something that I was actually conscious of until at least way later in high school. And I would say my view is that I do view it more so as a negative connotation, only because I love the idea of patriotism being this word that means we're in service of our country, we're in service of our neighbors, and of this idea of this country that we all have a say in. But I do think lately it has become this either or, where it's like, oh, if you don't believe in this, or this, and you're no longer a patriot. And so I think as people have kind of taken that word and redefined it in their own way as a litmus test for whether you do love this country or not, it has been something that I would say, me personally, I am turned off by, and it's upsetting because I think it does a disservice to the people who associate it positively, either because of their military service or because they were raised in a way to deeply love this country. And I think there's also this idea that if you are willing to criticize us as a nation, there's a small sect of the population that would say, oh, you're no longer a patriot. And I think just because that sect of the population can be so loud, it's even harder for us to build bridges to come back together and say no, this is what we mean by it, or this is what we should try to claim this word as.
Love that. Thank you guys. And it won't be a surprise that we're doing 5 webinars in our series, and very quickly we knew patriotism had to be one of the places we dug deep, because when we think about this idea that words used to be words and now they feel like these signals where all these assumptions about who I hang out with, what news I read, how I vote, when we say certain words, it seems like these signals are being sent, and patriotism is one of those words that we've experienced, we observed, and our research in 2021 told us was starting to move that way. And so we're excited to share where we are in 2023 on this word. So I'll pass it over to my colleague Siri to take us through the first look at this.
Yeah, so I'm super excited to share our data on patriotism with you, and hoping it'll spark some new insights, some new curiosity, and some great conversation as well. We're going to look at a number of different graphs, and I don't want you to get too overwhelmed by the details of numbers and things like that. We've designed this to help you see patterns and trends, and so I'll try to point those out as clearly as possible as we're moving through. So let's take a look at the first kind of high level. What are Americans' impressions of the term patriotism? So here you can see that the majority of Americans are positive on the term patriotism at 66%. The next largest group is people who said neither negative nor positive, maybe kind of in the middle or neutral. And then we have 12% of our respondents in our survey that said they had a negative impression of the term patriotism, and only 2% who are not familiar. So let's take a look now at how this compares to some of the other terms that we tested in 2023. So this is kind of a heat map. The purple is number of positive respondents. Yellow is unfamiliar. Gray is kind of that neutral group. And then orange are the folks who selected negative for their impression of any given term. So within the pack of our 21 terms here, you can see patriotism is kind of towards it's in the second half of the lower group there. And so we have terms in our survey that are much more positive than patriotism, such as freedom and liberty and community and service. You can see those at the top. We also have terms that are much less positive. So patriotism is kind of in the middle of the pack here when we look at it compared to our other terms. Now we're going to start looking at how this varies, though, by different demographic cuts and different life experiences. This slide is particularly fascinating. So we're looking at the age breakdown of people who said they were positive on the term patriotism. And you can see a very clear pattern that the older a person is, the more positive the more likely they are to be positive on the term patriotism. So that might be just an interesting curiosity for you to spend a little bit more time thinking about why might that be the case. The next slide shows us that this is not the same trend that we see for all of our 21 terms. And so these are all the 21. Again, just kind of look at the patterns. Don't get too locked into the details here. Patriotism is in that column, that first column on the left there towards the bottom. And you can see the pattern that I just showed you. If you look at some of the other terms that are near it, so right underneath that, unity does not have nearly the same pattern. There's much more even kind of spread across the age groups. Democracy, right above patriotism there, has a somewhat similar pattern, though not quite as striking, and clearly just every age group goes up in positivity. And then racial equity right next to patriotism there also has a different pattern, with interestingly younger folks and the most old among us being the most positive on racial equity. So wanted you to see how this pattern by age compares to some of our other terms as well. Now we're going to look at some other demographic cuts. So here you're looking at race and ethnicity. This is also making a huge difference in people's impression of the term patriotism. So we see a 25% difference in positivity between white Americans at the top, who are the most positive group, and Black Americans at the bottom, who are the least positive group. And then everyone else is kind of in that 50 to 60% range there in the middle, but interesting to note perhaps that Hispanic, Latina, or Latino are the second most positive group here. Now we're going to look at political ideology and how that's impacting. This, you'll note, is the difference that's making the biggest difference. So we see a 50% difference between those who self-identify as very liberal and those who identify as very conservative. That's a huge difference. Our most positive group, actually, though, is people who identify as somewhat conservative. So we saw some big differences by age and by race. The biggest difference, however, that we see is by political ideology. Now we're going to take a quick look into some comparative data. So how does patriotism today compare to what we saw in our survey in 2021? So our 2023 data here is in purple, our 2021 is in orange. And here you can see that all of the folks, all of the groups got more positive, except for those who identify as very liberal. And when looking at the somewhat liberal, we would say that's probably within the margin of error, and so that's not a meaningful increase there either. But very liberal is the only identity that got significantly less positive on the term patriotism in the last 2 years. This slide is interesting, and this goes back to something Jasmine brought up about her grandpa's military service. We had a question in our survey of which of the following civic activities have you participated in since you turned 18? And people could check all that apply. And then we mapped that onto positive impressions of the term patriotism. And here you can see the strongest connection between people who served in the military and having a positive impression of the term patriotism. The second highest positivity, which I think is kind of interesting, is people who said they've served on a jury. So those are our top two. If we go to the bottom, we see a cluster, the sort of cluster of cause or movement activities, I would say. So joined a social cause or movement, advocated for a cause, or attended a protest or a rally. Folks that checked that as an activity they participated in had the lowest positive response to the term patriotism. So that is a high-level tour of some of our top-line data, and now we'd like to turn it back to our speakers to share some of their reflections and sense-making on what we've seen so far. Let's start with Jasmine.
Great, thanks. I think one thing that I think about the most when it comes to the age breakdown is something that me and my coworkers actually talk about a lot, because we are very diverse in age and political perspectives at the foundation. And I think it's interesting. I'm totally going to age myself. I was born in 2001. And so I think for my generation, I think one assumption that I have about why we aren't as attached to these terms is because we've never been alive for a lot of the honestly devastating moments like 9/11 or a lot of wars that just other generations were alive for and have a lot more of a visceral connection to. And so that to me is why the age is not as surprising, but I do think it's also not as surprising that people who have served in the military or have done so many different of these activities are positive on the idea of like having a duty or having a sense of service to your country. And so, yeah, those are some of my reactions.
Great, thanks. Elaine, how about you?
Yes, thank you, Jasmine. And good point. Even if you aged yourself, I think it's helpful for the analysis. So yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. The first one goes back to actually the very first slide that we looked at, and where it said 66% of us view it as positive. And I think that's the thing that makes this country great, is that we all are inherently agreeing that this is a good, positive word. If you look at the negative and as you dive more into the numbers, you'll see it comes from a particularly far end approach where the folks in the middle are saying, hey, this is a good word. We want to figure out how to make it a good word again, if they don't feel it is already. But then if you add 66 and 19, we're at 85% of the country. And I feel like that's something to really highlight, that we get stuck in the polarization of the extremes of the political parties. And we forget to come back and focus on what we actually agree on. I thought that was really interesting. I also thought the age gap, the difference between the highest group and the lowest group, is indicative not only of what Jasmine brought up, which I think is a fair point in terms of that generation not experiencing a war or 9/11. Those are great examples. I also think it's an impact of us having very little civic education in the schools. That is something, and we have our own program here. It goes into schools, but it has been deprioritized, and you can even see that from the numbers at the funding level at your state, at the federal level, that other areas of education, STEM, for example, has increased exponentially over the years in terms of the funding they received. Civics has not. There's now there's a larger push now from the civics initiative that has been happening over the years, and I'm positive that this will get more. But if we're not teaching those values when they start, and teaching kids that this is an experiment, the American experiment is up to us to maintain. If not, the experiment goes away. And if we don't all find a way to ground ourselves in the love of this country, and that we understand we've made mistakes, that's okay. But what we do is we iterate and we get better. And that's what makes patriotism and the love of the country really beneficial. I think slide 14 was also fascinating to me. Let me see, I wanted to make sure I didn't get the numbers wrong. So if you look at the positivity, again, you will see that you can pull out the very far left. I'm not sure how they had defined very liberal, but there's still a big gap between somewhat liberal and very liberal of 24%. So even though there's a 50% gap, even within the liberals themselves, there's still a 24% gap. And that goes into the positive, the positive inclination of the very liberal that actually went down as opposed to up with the rest of the groups. And then I think the last thing is, from a conservative approach, there's been a number of studies that I think are fascinating to tie into this research. One of them that I've been grappling with and diving into is the fact that research has shown since they started doing this research tied to conservative and liberalism, is that conservatives tend to naturally have a deeper connection with country, family, and religion. And that was fascinating to pull in. I'm not making any sort of hypotheses, but I think it's a data point to consider as we dive into some of these numbers.
Awesome. Thank you both. And your civic education and civic learning point is really important, Elaine. We did a couple weeks ago, we did a cut of the research with the civic education, because we did ask the question, did you have civic education? We had a whole bunch of options in the survey, so we could get really nuanced on that. And the storyline, of course, very macro. We have some nuance that I think is important also to not overlook. But the more civic ed, the more positive and the more familiar people are. So not rocket science, but also I think important for us to take into account as we think about the words that we use and what's making an influence here. So what I'd love to do is talk you through some of the other elements of the survey and how it relates to patriotism, because I think there's some real juice to squeeze here. So we had a question that asked folks, who do you think this term is meant for? So when we pulled just the patriotism out here, really important to see here that Americans believe that patriotism is meant for me or somewhat meant for me at a higher rate than for someone else. So there is a signal being sent here from Americans that there is a sense of connection and ownership of this word, more than they think it's not for them. We, of course, do see this slightly differently when we look at it from the political lens. So here we're looking at political ideology, and we see that conservatives feel like it's meant for them at a higher rate than liberals do, and liberals feel like it's meant for somebody else at a higher rate. So it seems that conservatives feel a stronger sense of connection and ownership of patriotism, and liberals agree it's meant for someone else. So it seems that there's some interesting political things here that are at play. Honestly, this tracks with a lot of what we have observed and why we wanted to have this conversation and do this webinar. But the data is supporting a perception that this word is really for conservatives. We wanted to also understand people's perception of the word patriotism as its degree to which it brings people together or drives people apart. And so this was how the question was worded. Do you think patriotism brings people together? And they had these options here. So we could kind of get a sense on the spectrum of where Americans were on this. And here we see that, over 50% of Americans believe that the word patriotism brings people together, whether a lot or a little, and far more than people who believe it drives people apart. So again, some of what Elaine was saying carries through for me here. Like, there's actually a lot of good news here for us about the term patriotism. It's not quite as polarizing when we get down to it as we may be experiencing in our field or in our lives or by what we perceive. Americans are kind of telling us a different story here. Oh, I went too fast. But again, we do see this, of course, too, politically telling us a story where conservatives feel more likely that it does bring people together, and liberals are experiencing and perceiving it as driving people apart. So I wanted to show that number too. There was also a question that asked folks, does this term motivate you to, and then insert verb here. So for the words in the cluster that patriotism was in, they received the question of, does this word make you feel motivated to help others in your community? So this is our civic engagement cluster, and this was kind of the action that we asked people, to what degree does this word motivate you to do this? And we see that patriotism is about middle of the pack for this group of words. We gave everyone a motivation score from 1 to 5, 5 being very motivated and 1 being very unmotivated. So that's how we get this composite number here. So it's about middle of the road in its effectiveness to be motivating, people reporting it motivating them to do action within their community. And just to give you a zoomed out sense of this, these are all the 21 terms and the degree to which each of the words Americans were reporting motivated them to do their corresponding civic activity. So for those folks in the words in the democracy cluster, it was like, how effective is the word freedom in motivating you to vote? For the racial equity cluster, it was, how much does this word motivate you to stand up for a cause you care about? Just to orient you to some of the coloring you're seeing on the slide. But what I really want you to see here is that patriotism falls within the orbit of our 21 words to the bottom third as Americans reporting its influence in motivating them to do civic action in their community, which we think is something to note. Siri, I'll turn to you for the negative and positive look.
Yeah, so we've seen term impression so far. We also had a follow-up question within each cluster of 7 terms that people got to see. Which of these 7, we asked them, are you the most positive on and why? And which one are you the most negative on and why? And they were served up a group of reasons that they could select up to 3. So we're going to show you the results for patriotism. So here you can see that patriotism was the second most positive term chosen by Americans, and it was also the second most negative term chosen by Americans. So the most positive in this cluster was community, perhaps not surprising, and the least positive or most negative was bipartisan. Now, why is that true? Oh, before we get there, let's take a look at how patriotism compares to some of the other terms in the cluster. So in contrast to a term like community, you can see the vast majority of people by political party were positive on that term if they selected it as either their most positive or most negative. Perhaps, sadly for this group, civic engagement and bridging were selected across the board as most negative. But patriotism has a very distinct pattern compared to these others. So if you sort by political party, you can see again that we have Democrats and independent leaning Democrats selecting that patriotism was their most negative at a much higher rate, and conservatives or Republicans and independents who lean Republican selecting it as their most positive at much higher rate. So again, we're seeing that political party difference here. So now we're going to look at why. What are the reasons that people selected for this? So for those that selected it as their most positive of the 7 terms, the top 2 reasons they gave us are patriotism, the term aligns with my personal values. That was the overwhelming number 1 option that people selected. The second top option was that it makes me feel hopeful about the future. So for a lot of people, patriotism has that connotation of deeply aligned to their personal values and provoking those feelings of hope about the future. On the flip side, for people that selected patriotism as their most negative, the top reason that they gave is it makes me think of people that I don't like. And that is different from what we're seeing for the most negative reason given on some of our other terms. So we really want to sit with this and just try to figure out how we can maybe like break that association a little bit for people. Some of the other top reasons on the negative side were politicians portrayed the term in a negative light. People said they have negative experiences with the term patriotism, and it makes them feel fearful about the future. And then when we look at that again, broken down by political ideology, we see that, again, kind of calling out the liberal, the very liberal, and the somewhat liberal, really saying like their top reason for not liking the term patriotism is that it makes them think of people they don't like. So we're just holding that and sitting with that and wondering kind of what we might be able to do about that as a field. So that's a little snapshot into the most positive and most negative and why. So we're going to turn it back over to our speakers to get their takes on this. Elaine, we'll start with you this time.
Great. I'm seeing the comments in the chat, and yes, very interesting. I think I've looked at this deck for the past like 3 days since I've received it and just dissecting and seeing what really stands out to me. And, you know, the cluster of the first bit of slides that they showed in terms of majority people thinking it, like whether it brings us together or not, majority of people do. It was more fascinating to me than to break it down and see that it becomes a liberal versus conservative battle of who sees it and who doesn't. If the liberal see this word as something that they can't own, if you can't step in and say, hey, I'm proud of my country, even if it screws up here and again, that's going to create disconnect between feeling that you're a patriot and an advocate for your country. And I think you're seeing that. The other thing, actually, going back to what Jasmine said at the beginning in terms of age, slide 23 for me, which was people, what was it? Liberals think it drives people apart. I think it'd be fascinating to slice the data by age. I feel that there's, and I'm making an assumption, I do not have a research study, I know what's out there, that as you become older, you also get more conservative. And so it'd be interesting to marry that with the very liberal and somewhat liberal and what the age demographic breakdown is. So that's where my nerdy hat went on and wanted to hear that. The other thing I thought was looking at the I think it was slide 28, which talked about I thought that was very stark, the patriotism, that half of it was negative and half of it was positive in terms of the actual term. If you go into the data a little bit more, it's the one where it was like the people thought of, but it broke it down. So I found this slide super fascinating. Oh, you've got it pulled up. Thank you. So people thought of, so, you know, I immediate was like, okay, if I'm a liberal, who would I think of as negative? You're like, okay, Donald Trump, that's kind of the easy one to kind of pull. But the other thing is, if you combine people thought of media portrayal and politicians, that's kind of the lump for the liberals. And if you flip it and you look at what made it positive for conservative, it's family, friends, and community portrayal. It's feelings about the future and it's personal value. And you can see it's like, so who is framing where they're getting their information from? So that's really what it caused me to think through. That could be totally wrong, but I think that really would be an interesting thing to dive in more, because that's very clear for me when I saw this chart. But that's my thoughts on these, Jasmine.
If we could stay on this slide, I had a somewhat similar thought. I must also say I am like annoyingly progressive, even though like the foundation that I work for is not. And I also am someone that is like deeply embarrassed by the Democrat Party most of the time. And so I also know that like I live in Kansas and the Midwest is like more progressively red. And I love that because I love people participating in democracy. But I do think from my experience when I was organizing with more progressive people, the reason that I think this could be perceived negatively is just because of how polarized we are. And I think oftentimes, not to make like a broad assumption of Democrats, but most of the time we see conservatives as like the enemy. Like there's no way to like build consensus or there's no negotiation. And so I do think, and oftentimes that's what we see in the media is it's this person or that person. Like you can't believe this thing and that thing. And I have a very conservative family. And so I was always raised to still like see the humanity in people regardless of what we're disagreeing about. And I think that may be a piece for liberals that gets lost in all the noise. And I do think there was a completely separate point that I wanted to make. Oh, on the slide about the words that motivate us to action, I think it was around 26. While it is devastating for civic engagement and bridging, I think it's a positive sign for hope about the word patriotism. And I think even for me, where civic is in my job title, I often still have people ask me, okay, but like, what do you do? Because the word civic engagement or civic education is so lost on us without having civic education, like Elaine had pointed to as a huge gap in our education system, that I do think, for me, it makes me more hopeful about the future of the word patriotism. And totally paints how much more work that we all have to do around like civic specific terms. So that was one thing that really stuck out to me, that even with how polarized the word still seems, it's doing better than civic engagement. So
I want to point one thing out because I stare at this data all the time and I always find new things. But on this slide, did you guys see this one? Confidence using the term, very conservative, as those folks are negative on the term patriotism for a reason of confidence using the term. I was just very surprised to see that because of how much associational perception is happening around conservatives like and use and, you know, love the word patriotism, but very conservative people are telling us there's something going on here with, for some, their confidence using the term.
Yeah.
And that really was interesting to me. There's a whole universe of confidence that we want to look at in this analysis, because this gives us a hook into what types of people feel confident using different words. But that really stuck out to me too, this confidence
I wonder
thing. Yeah.
if that's some connection to David's comment in the chat, is like if there's a question that can be asked around like, do people consider patriotic to be a definition they relate to, even if they're critical of the actions of our country? Because I do think like that could illustrate the confidence element of, am I confident in the definition? Am I confident in what I assume the definition is? So yeah, I think that's a great point.
Yeah, or if you're confident saying the word to somebody that might not agree with you.
Right.
So like conservatives might feel confident using the term with other conservatives, but not confident using it with liberals.
Yeah.
Right. Awesome. Such good thinking. Such good stuff. Siri, you want to take us into, okay, so what do we do? Let's not stay. How do we move through this?
Yeah. So we have at PACE access to a tool and a partner called Pluralytics, and it's an AI-powered language intelligence tool. And so what we're going to do is just show you some results of us playing around with an AI tool, helping us to write about patriotism in a way that might help bridge divides. So when you all registered, we asked you what you were interested in seeing for this demonstration, and you said, hey, I'd love to see how to talk about patriotism in a way that helps bridge divides. So that's what we're going to look at. And just briefly, a little bit about Pluralytics as a tool. We can input into their system any piece of text, and we'll show you the text we chose for this example, and then it scores it for us based upon a benchmark of how bridgy is this writing. So is it going to reach across divides, or is it only going to reach one or two groups of people? So it gives you a score, and then from that, you can have it do rewriting for you. It can rewrite the whole thing. It can rewrite specific sentences. And it's in the end up to us as humans what we want to do with those suggestions, if we want to keep them or toss them, if we want to mix and match them, if we want to incorporate them in different ways. But that's how the tool works. And so in advance of this gathering, we selected a piece of text and put it into Pluralytics. So we pulled this definition from Stanford's Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is a great site, a free site I commend to you, on all kinds of different topics, but they have a really fascinating entry on patriotism. And this is the definition. And then if you really dive in there, it goes into like all kinds of different philosophical nuance. But for the purposes of today, we just picked the definition in that entry, which is patriotism can be defined as love of one's country, identification with it, and special concern for its well-being and that of compatriots. So we took that bit of text and we put it into Pluralytics AI tool. It scored it for us and it said, okay, it's not meeting your benchmark. It's not that bridgy in this format. So then we had to do some rewriting for us, and we selected it to write tweets for us. So what we're going to show you on the next slide is 3 different bridgy tweets about patriotism written by this AI tool. So the first one is, patriotism is that warm feeling of love for your country that fuels the drive to contribute to its well-being and the welfare of your fellow citizens. Hashtag country love. The second option that it generated for us is, true patriotism is not just about national pride. It's a profound love that includes identifying with your nation and caring deeply about your fellow citizens' well-being. Hashtag patriotism is love. And then the third option, and this one, I'll have to admit, it's getting a little warm and fuzzy, but you can see how it lands for you. Patriotism is a warm embrace, a heart's whisper of love for your country that propels you toward enhancing its welfare and that of its people. Hashtag country love. So those are 3 tweets written by Pluralytics AI tool that score highly at being able to bridge across divides when speaking about patriotism. So we took these 3 and tried to think of, okay, what are some takeaway lessons from these options that we might be able to apply when talking and writing about patriotism, especially if we're in contexts where we're trying to bridge divides, or we know we're in an audience that's diverse politically, diverse by age, diverse by race, etc. So these are some of the takeaways, and would love to hear kind of your thoughts on them too. But the first one is to really lean in to that idea of loving your country as not as a like abstract idea, but really like it's about taking care of your fellow citizens, right? So there's a focus on love of country as loving the people that you share that country with. And then the second one is focusing on patriotism as relational versus just some blind allegiance to an abstract concept. So again, really grounding it in that relationship between people, more so even perhaps than what one thinks abstractly about the country as a whole. The third takeaway is to use active verbs that empower people and put them in the story of patriotism. So helping people see themselves within the story that patriotism can be about. And so words like contribute, enhance, and even, yes, don't be afraid to say the word love. So those were some of our takeaways from these AI-generated tweets about patriotism, and would be so curious to hear from a couple of you just what you think about this. Does it resonate with you? Do you think it's bridgy? Do you like it? Would love if anybody has a thought or two. Orange is the most romantic. Yes, Jasmine.
I'll also just add in
Yeah.
that this is very, we asked Pluralytics to optimize this for diverse audiences. If we had asked it to optimize for Gen Z, which is another benchmark we have, or optimize it for rural communities, which is another benchmark we had, or any of the other benchmarks we could create, it might have spit something else out. So what we want to just make sure you see is like, this is us asking us to take the term patriotism as we defined it from that script and make it as broadly appealing as possible. And this is what it gave us back. We just think this is an interesting input, right? It doesn't mean we have to adopt any of this, but just a way for us to get some indicators of, based on an ocean's amount of data that Pluralytics has at its fingertips, what are some ways that we can talk about patriotism that will be heard? Not just what we think is important to say, but that we can feel a lot more confidence in will be heard. So just want to make that point too.
Yeah, great. We're seeing some votes with hearts and comments for yellow. The yellow option here is perhaps the favorite of the three. So yeah, it's kind of fun to see what resonates with different people. But yeah, even AI perhaps has a heart. Can be romantic.
Can I make a verbal comment?
Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm thinking about this in my own self, and the use of the term love, and how, as a thoughtful person who wants to be rational and reasoning, I tend to discard those emotional words when maybe I should be using them more often to connect humanly with people.
Yeah, that's a great insight. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Anybody else want to give voice to a reaction?
Angela.
Yeah, I just want to follow on what Marjorie said. One of the things that I love about this, and it may be because of the nature of the foundation I work for, I think it's really exciting and provocative to think about bringing this kind of language into the public square. How do we normalize having language around our shared humanity? So I think this is really exciting.
Mm-hmm. I love that point, Angela, because this might be my own biases coming into play, but patriotism to me is usually a word I think about like war and like hard charging and seriousness, and nothing like that showed up here. It was also heart oriented and relational. I really feel the caretaking really felt like a theme that popped for me. And so, I think that's interesting about, well, what is, again, AI is a tool for us, but this tool is telling us that if you want to hit human ears with the most appeal, like lean into those aspects, which I think is a bit of a rebrand for patriotism, at least how I experience it in my world.
Yeah, I think we all need to be stewards of our country. And that's something that I think could not make it as soft, but I'm like you saw. I wasn't afraid to say the word love, so AI and I have some common.
Are you a human? No, yeah. That's great. Yeah, and we were also, Siri, do you want to share the reflection we had with our colleague about patriotism as an alternative to nationalism?
Yeah. one of our colleagues who identifies as conservative was saying that he's starting to see a conversation within kind of his community of patriotism as a really important counterpoint to nationalism, and that there's some interesting thinking happening about the distinction between patriotism and nationalism, and how might we reclaim patriotism as something that's for all of us and is about this relational sense of taking care of each other, where nationalism doesn't have that same connotation. So I thought that was an interesting insight that he had to share. Kevin, yeah. We also had a question in the chat. How did AI define Bridgie? So the language tool that Pluralytics uses has an ocean of data, and they group people into these 5 different value segments. And so when they're creating the benchmark for us, they're saying you really need to have high appeal to these 2 or 3 of the 5 segments in order for it to count as Bridgie. And there's a lot more that could be said about that, but that's something that our partners at Pluralytics do all the behind the scenes kind of figuring it out for us. They were, in this case, though, specifically taking into account political difference when thinking about bridging divides. Great question. All right.
Awesome. Well, then I can start moving us towards wrap up. So I want to just offer folks an invitation to keep learning with us. And so we have a dashboard, all of our data, the thousands and thousands of paper that came back from the survey, we organized into an interactive dashboard. For those of you who are with us in 2021, it is a more sophisticated version of what you saw then that also includes 2021 data. So you can have all the 21 top lines and crosstabs and the 23. You have full access to this. This is free 24/7 access to both sets of data. All you have to do is let us know you're interested in it at pacefunders.org/language, and we'll get you the login info. So this is kind of the always available to you way to look at our data, and no limit on the number of people and how many times you can use it. We just hope it's a really helpful resource to folks, particularly in this election year where we know there's a lot of thinking and questions about communication right now. So that's available to you. If you can't get what you need off the dashboard and there's a version or a question that you have that you are interested in seeing a graph for, we are also offering free data visualizations by request. And so it's through this portal, which you can also get at /language on our website. And actually it's a place for you to submit your request and then vote on other people's requests. Every week we will take the top 5 vote getters and have our data scientist make the graphic, and then we'll post it right back here so everyone can learn together on what people are interested in. So want you to know this is available to you at all times. You can make as many requests as you want. Every week we'll take the top 5 and post so we can all learn together. If you are interested, I don't have a slide on this, but if you are interested in that Pluralytics tool, you can also let us know at /language. We have a certain number of seats that we have in our partnership with Pluralytics to offer. We're getting close to being at the cap of that, but then we also can offer seats beyond that for a small price. So if it is a tool that you would like access to, again, particularly in a year like 2024, let us know and express interest with us, and we can make sure you get whatever resource you need if that tool is appealing to you. And we also want folks to know we have an ongoing webinar series on topics like this one. So we did patriotism today, and our next one in May is going to be what should we say to Gen Z? So we'll be looking at our data about the terms that Gen Z is gravitating to, the ones they're not gravitating to, what we can see by different political ideologies, urbanicities. We'll look at it from a lot of different angles. So mark your calendars for that. And then you can see from here, we'll also be looking at the terms racial equity. In June, we'll be looking at what to say to rural communities. So if you work with that community or folks who identify as rural, that would be probably a helpful one for you in July. And then should we say democracy will be our concluding webinar in August, kind of right before we go to that hardcore election season. We know this is probably the word of greatest interest across our data set. So we'll be spending a lot of good time considering together, should we say democracy and what does that look like? Lastly, we are going to be on the road a ton over the next couple of months. So this is these are some of the places that we'll be stopping on our road show. So if you're going to be at any of these, please come find us and say hello. Also, if you are interested in having Siri or myself or a colleague talk about the PACE research and the civic language research to your group, just reach out, let us know. We want to make sure that this research is as helpful to people who need it right now as it can be. So please don't hesitate to reach out. And then lastly, Siri's going to actually put a Zoom poll up. And while she does, it's 5 questions, hopefully they are quick questions that we'll hope you fill out so that we can just learn about where you're at after this conversation and what more support would be helpful. Siri, do you have that poll going up? Okay, great. I guess I don't have it on my view. That's cool. And then we also, while you fill that out, we're hopeful you can share what you learned today. We do a recap of all of our webinars on our website. So we'll be sending that out to you. So you have that link. You'll get this slide deck. You'll get the recording. We'll also share our top 3 takeaways. So you can kind of revisit all that. And we hope you share it with your networks on social and let people know that this research exists. We hope you get into the dashboard itself and into the data. So let us know if you're interested in that. Go ahead and request some data visualizations. Let us know if you want to get on the AI tool. And we do hope you join us for our future webinars. So that's what we have for you today. How are we doing on the poll? Are we at a good percentage?
I don't think anyone's taking it.
Okay.
Or I don't know, maybe people can't see it.
It popped up and then it went away.
Is it
I
back?
can't see it.
It only
Okay.
popped up the results as like unanswered for all of them. I can't like
All right.
answer the questions anymore.
Let me see if I can restart it here.
Zoom, don't fail us.
No. I don't know. It's
Okay.
not working.
All right, no worries. We'll send it out as follow-up to this email and hope you guys can click through and just give us a sense of where you're at after this conversation. Mostly we want to see where your impressions of the word patriotism are after this, if anything has changed. So we're actually excited to give you a little bit of time back. We'll stay on the line if anyone wants to chat or has other thoughts based on this research. Otherwise, thanks so much for joining, guys, and we hope you join us for future webinars. Thanks all.